Welcome back to our last lesson, and in this lesson of this mini course, we are going to be looking at art censorship, and particularly we are going to be pondering the question, is censorship justifiable in certain situations? So we hear the word censorship pretty regularly when we're dealing with book bannings or the concept of free speech, or what qualifies as free speech, what qualifies as hate speech, and such. And so this is a term that is used fairly frequently. But how can it be applied to art, and what does it mean when dealing with works of art? So typically when we're dealing with works of art and kind of them being censored, we're dealing with art that offends. And so what do people find offensive about works of art? What reasons do people have to censor art? So typical reasons are it challenges those in power, it offends religious beliefs, considered pornographic, or represents values others do not share. Now, typically, people do not consider censorship a crime. Some people consider it a crime against free speech to deal with censorship. But I included in this kind of mini course dealing with the value of art and art crime because censorship tends to lead to art vandalism and iconoclasm, because people who believe that art should be censored or get offended over works of art typically are not satisfied in just the work of art being censored and would rather have the work of art completely destroyed or wiped out. So oftentimes the censorship does kind of end up in a negative way, but in other cases it just results in the work of art being censored from public view or having warning labels put attached to it to kind of warn people to the subject of what's going on. So it really just depends on the context of the censorship as to the reasons why and what's happening. Now, for the general question of this course of is censorship justifiable, that is best left up to not for me to answer, but for each individual person to answer for themselves. But we will be looking at several cases of censorship, and we will ponder over whether they were justifiable in their specific actions. So the first one we are going to be looking at is probably one that people don't normally think of as censored. This is Michelangelo's Last Judgment. So the Last Judgment was painted well after Michelangelo finished the Sistine Chapel. So this is the altar wall in the Sistine Chapel. And the time period where this was done, the Sistine Chapel was one of the private chapels used by the Pope. So after Michelangelo did the ceiling, he was working on other projects. He didn't want to paint anymore, and so the Pope sent a request that he wanted the altar wall completed as well. Michelangelo didn't want to do it, but he insisted, and so the work began and was completed. So Michelangelo did it the way he wanted to do it. After he finished, and even during the process, this painting was considered amoral and offensive due to the presence of nude figures. So the painting was entirely covered in nude figures, and a lot of the prominent religious figures were nude as well. And so many of the constituents in the Catholic diocese at the time wanted the mural to be destroyed and completely wiped over and have someone else come in and replace it. Rather than destroying the mural, because it was a work by Michelangelo, who was a very significant artist at the time, the Catholic diocese decided they would edit the work, and so they would censor it a little bit. So Daniel da Volterra, who was not exactly a pupil of Michelangelo, but he was familiar with Michelangelo and he was familiar with his work, so I guess you could use the word pupil. So he was brought in to censor the work. And so basically what he was brought in to diaper the people by placing clothing in strategic locations. So one example of this is here in this particular scene. So you can kind of see where certain areas have been kind of fuzzed out, or clothing has been placed in strategic locations to cover up any of the genitalia that was exposed through the painting. Now, most of this has been removed, so restoration to the original design that Michelangelo attended has been ongoing through the 20th century at different stages, and so they have managed to remove most of kind of what was added at a later date and restore it to its original design. This, of course, was very controversial still, like all art restoration and such, but that is, again, for another discussion for another day. Now, this particular art censorship was a strange one. So, this is a John Singer Sargent's portrait of Madame X. And so, this particular censorship was done by the artist himself. And so, he censored his own work after facing a huge backlash. So, the story behind this particular painting, John Singer Sargent, an American artist, he was working in France at the time. And in order to make it in France, you had to make it in the French salons. So, he approached kind of like the major socialite at the time and asked her to allow him to paint her portrait. And so she was intrigued and she allowed it. And he worked tirelessly over this portrait and presented to her. She was extremely offended and thought it was a very pornographic way to to portray her, and so he was aghast at her feeling this way and told her that he would fix it. Now, the main difference between this portrait now and what was seen then was that the right dress strap on her right shoulder here was down off on her arm. So it wasn't up on her shoulder, it was off down onto her arm. And so it wasn't placed in kind of like a secure position. It was more seductive, you could say. And so this was extremely offensive to the people in France, the wealthier people at the time. And so she was completely offended and spread the word about this particular travesty against her, basically. And so Sargent was blacklisted and kind of had to leave France in shame at not being able to, complete his dream of being a famous artist. But once he got back to the U.S., he found a lot of the wealthier wives or wealthier women of the upper crust society really liked the idea of being portrayed in kind of like a seductress, femme fatale kind of way. And so they all wanted their portrait to be done in this particular fashion. And so he became a famous American artist portrait maker in the US. Now, this particular sculpture, this was a very odd case of censorship, and it was mostly done by location. So this is a sculpture by Frederick Macmonnies, and so this is a sculpture, Bacchanal and the Infant Faun. So a Bacchanal is a follower of the god Bacchus. The Bacchus was the Roman god of wine, orgies, sexual pleasure, and he was related to the Greek god Dionysus. And so this was a very traditional classical subject matter, particularly for the time period. The subject matter wasn't really in question in terms of the art world. It was very typical. So this wasn't an unusual subject matter. What was unusual about it was what happened when it was meant to be installed. So this was designated as a public sculpture, and it was meant to be installed in front of the Boston Public Library in a public place. And the Temperance League took offense to this particular sculpture and viewed it as provocative or offensive or demonic in such nature. Now, if you're not familiar with the Temperance League was a organization in the 1800s and early 1900s that was working towards the prohibition of alcohol. And their main cry against alcohol was they were working to protect women and children from drunk husbands beating on them and such. And then their second reason was prevention of amoral acts. And so they viewed a follower of the god Bacchus, who was the god of wine and sexual pleasure and orgies and parties, as extremely amoral and extremely offensive, and so they did not think that this particular sculpture should be displayed in public. Now, I don't recall if they called for this sculpture's complete destruction. I think they did, just based off of the fuss that they kicked up. And so the sculpture was removed from its public location and was put into the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art, where it still is today. Now, this particular censorship is unusual in a different way. So this is a censorship of Ai Weiwei. He is a Chinese artist, and so this particular work was censored in China but it's more that Ai Weiwei himself has been censored. So this is a work of art. This is called Sacred, and this is 6 different pieces that represent the time when he was imprisoned for 81 days for expressing dissent against Chinese government. So he was basically imprisoned and basically made a political prisoner in China. And so, as he was a dissenter, his work has been censored heavily in China so that it can't be viewed in public. Most of it can't be viewed in public, and he's not typically discussed. So, each model of this particular, like each individual model, is a half scale representation of his time in jail. So, you can kind of see here what it would look like on the inside. This is the E one. This is entropy. And so this one represents kind of the officials coming to check on him, and he's in his bed, and kind of what it would look like in his little cell as he was kind of kept as a dissenter in China. So this is a type of censorship that is part of the political views others do not share, particularly in areas where it is heavily monitored and such. And so this work was exhibited in the cathedral in Venice, and so there people were allowed to see it. And but Ai Weiwei is not permitted to leave China, and so he is not allowed. He was not allowed to travel with his work of art. Now, this one does bring a lot of controversy. This is a photograph by Andre Serrano, and the typical name for this one is called Piss Christ. And so this was a photo that was taken in 1987, and where Serrano took a crucifix and submerged it into urine, and submerged it into a jar of urine, and then took a picture of it. So, when this first debuted in New York, it got a lot of praise because of its very unique design and just interesting color features. But when it started to move into other parts of the country, it was considered religiously offensive, and so pretty much every exhibition that had it featured inside or had it featured in it would receive a lot of backlash from different people. So much so that Serrano received death threats for over 15 years for this particular work of art. And recently, in 2011, the photograph was actually attacked when it was on display, and the glass was completely smashed, and that damaged the photo inside of it. So this is what I meant by people when they said that censorship isn't enough, and that sometimes vandalism results as a end result of censorship. I do believe that when this work was kind of on tour, that it would come with a warning that people might find it offensive, and so that would kind of qualify it under kind of how it was censored in a particular way. Now, this isn't a photograph of the actual exhibit. This is the artist. So this is Robert Mapplethorpe. And the exhibit that was censored was called The Perfect Moment. And it's really hard to find good images of what this particular exhibit represented. So this was a photography exhibition featuring highly sexualized images. And so when this was touring and it was reaching kind of the DC area, a couple senators caught word of kind of what was in it, and they basically forced the gallery to cancel the exhibition because it was deemed extremely pornographic and inappropriate for public view. And so this did lead to a lot of censorship, particularly to how the work was remembered, and it is still difficult to find photos that feature every single piece from this particular exhibition. So the censorship is still holding. So even after this particular time period, the remaining gallery stops on this particular tour were hesitant to kind of display the works for fear of kind of drawing more attention to this particular type of attention and censorship area. Now, this is the Vietnam Memorial, and I know some people probably aren't aware that this was the victim of censorship, but particular this particular one was kind of a result, and it was what happened with this is that there was a commission for the Vietnam Memorial to be constructed because they were working on other memorials at the time. And so there was a contest for the designs to be submitted. And Mylan was a, I believe, Vietnamese American college student at the time. And so she submitted her design, and her design was approved. So the monument faced a lot of backlash from members of Congress because of kind of how this particular work was viewed. And so people saw it as an attempt to shame the American kind of efforts for the Vietnam conflict. And so the members of Congress wanted it taken down. They viewed the industry of black marble and the way that it's kind of sinking into the ground. They thought it was a way to shame people, but so in this way, it would represent values others did not share. But when the memorial was made public and people were able to come see it, they really enjoyed the memorial. And so the censorship of this particular monument didn't go through exactly. They wanted it replaced with a different one. And obviously, it did not work. So this, you could say, was an attempt at censorship rather than censorship itself. Now, the last one we're going to look at one that is censored in different types of media. And this is one that I noticed frequently, and I find it extremely funny, so that is why I've included it. So this is a painting by Fragonard. And so Fragonard was a painter in the mid-1700s. And so he was part of the Rococo period. And this one is his most famous painting, one of his most famous, called The Swing. So the artist Fragonard is known for his hedonistic paintings with very seductive sexual themes kind of hidden beneath the layers. And so this particular one is not unique in that. So this one is a very sexually charged, hedonistic kind of lifestyle painting. And that is the theme for a lot of his works. But this painting isn't typically censored in public. It is scandalous in some areas for people who know what it represents. For others, it's just a very idyllic kind of painting. But the problem is that this painting is typically featured in a lot of alternate media, particularly children's media. And so it is censored a lot in those particular media, particularly in the movie Frozen. So this movie featured this particular painting in one particular area, but it removed a lot of the themes of the painting that would report to it being more of a hedonistic or more of the morals of the painting, such as the man hiding in the bushes, a lot of the sculptures in the background that are more sexually charged, and a couple of the other aspects of the painting that were not appropriate. So whenever this painting is utilized in children's literature, children's media, and it typically is because of the very eye-catching view of a woman in a pink dress and a swing in just a nice green forest. It's a very nice contrast. It's a very nice view. And so this particular painting is used a lot for media. And so whenever it is, it's censored. And so they censor out all of the extra attributes that point to what the origin of the painting is. And so the origin of the painting is a very hedonistic subject, as the commissioner of the painting wanted a subject that not a lot of other painters would do, something very sexually charged of him interacting with his mistress. And so it was an unusual painting that Fragonard did, but people like the kind of idyllic feel of it. So in order to use it, the subject matter is cleaned up and it's censored a lot to be used in public. So this is kind of an unusual type of censorship, but it is kind of more in the way of kind of like censoring your language around different people to make it a little more PG friendly is kind of what this particular one goes. So this is the end of this particular mini lesson. Hopefully you can be able to think critically on the subject of censorship and how censorship operates and how it should kind of be viewed in the future, and kind of how you should view it of is censorship a aspect against free speech, or is it understandable for certain situations, so that it is definitely something to consider in the future.